Tutorial is for 5th grade Module 1, Lesson 8b. In this lesson, we're going to use our place value knowledge to help us round decimals. The first section says to round each number to the nearest whole number. If I look at question A, I have the number 7 462 thousandths, and I'm going to round that to the nearest whole number. So the first step is to identify the existing whole number. So the whole number would be the 7 in the ones place. That means that my choices when I round will be either 7 or 8. That will be my final answer. Now what I'm going to do is look at the number in the place value to the right. That will help me decide whether I'm going to round up or down. Now I know from previous lessons that the midpoint between my two whole numbers would have a 5 in the tenths place. So for example, the midpoint between 7 and 8 is 7 5/10. So I have to decide, is the existing number greater than the midpoint or less than the midpoint? Since there is a 4 in my tenths place, that tells me that this number is less than the midpoint, and so I'm going to round down. So this number rounded to the nearest whole number is 7. Looking at question B, the whole number here is 19. So my answer choices will be 19 or 20. Again, I'll look at the number in my tenths place. The midpoint would be 19 5/10. Since I have 19 2/10, that's below the midpoint, so that would round down to 19. In problem C, the whole number is 9. I'll look at the number in the tenths place. 9 5/10 would be the midpoint. 9 7/10 is above the midpoint, so this number would round up. That means I will go to the next whole number, and that next whole number would be 10. So 9 75 hundredths rounds to 10. In the next section, I'm going to round my numbers to the nearest tenth. Question A, the number is 3 32 hundredths. The first thing I want to do is identify the number that's in the tenths place, and that number is 3. So that means my answer choices will be 3 3/10 or 3 4/10. Again, I will look at the next place value number and decide whether that is above the midpoint or below the midpoint. For this number, the midpoint would be 3 35 hundredths. We're always looking for that 5 for the next place value over. 3 32 hundredths would be below the midpoint, so this will round down to 3 3/10. For problem B, I have 56 79 hundredths. Again, the first step is to identify the tenths place. So that would be a 7. That means my answer choices will be 56 7/10 or 56 8/10. I will look at my hundredths place. The midpoint would have a 5 in the hundredths place. Well, since I have a 9 in the hundredths place, that means I'm above the midpoint. That means my tenth will round up to the next tenth, which would be 8. So my final answer is 56 8/10. And in question C, I have 1 432 thousandths. The 4 is in my tenths place. I'm going to look at the next place over, my hundredths place. The midpoint would have a 5 in that place. Well, since 3 is less than 5, I know that I'm going to round down. Now here my answer choices would have been 1 4/10 or 1 5/10. Since I'm rounding down, the final answer would be 1 4/10. And the last rounding we will do is rounding numbers to the nearest hundredth. Question A has 2 153 thousandths. I'll identify the digit in the hundredths place first, so that would be a 5. That means that my answer choices will be 2 15 hundredths or 2 16 hundredths. I will look to the digit in the thousandths place to help me decide. I have a 3 in the thousandths place right now. A 5 in this place would show the midpoint. So since 3 is less than the midpoint of 5, I know that I'm going to round down to 2 15/100ths. For question B, I have 10 and 886 thousandths. I will find the digits that's in the hundredths place first. So that means my answer choices are going to be 10 and 88 hundredths or 10 and 89 hundredths. Looking at the thousandths place, I have a 6. Well, that 6 would be above the midpoint of 5. That means I'm going to round up to the next hundredth. So my answer would be 10 and 89 hundredths. And my last problem, I have 2 and 198 thousandths. The 9 is in the hundredths place. That means my answer choices would be 2 and 19 hundredths or 2 and 20 hundredths. I'll look at the thousandths place. I have an 8 here, so that means I'm above the midpoint, which means I'm going to round to the next hundredth up. So that would be 2 and 20 hundredths. So some things to notice here. When I'm rounding to the nearest hundredth, my final digit in my rounded number is in the hundredths place, and I still need to include the parts of the number that came before the hundredths place to make sure that my number is complete.